Good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're here in person on Park Avenue or joining us online at stbarts.org, it is my delight to welcome you to the forum. Each week here we have sacred conversations about the things that matter, and it is a joy to welcome a lot of great guests to the forum, but it is an even more pleasurable joy to welcome one of our own. And actually, in the coming weeks, we're going to welcome several of our own parishioners to talk about their areas of expertise. And we are really fortunate to have with us Elizabeth Kelley, who is an attorney who works with clients with mental disabilities as they navigate the criminal justice system. She is truly a leader in her field, several publications, leadership roles in the American Bar Association. We're very fortunate to have you among us, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for doing this today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Peter. Is the mic on?
It is, I think, as close as you can hold it.
Wonderful, thank you.
The easier it will be to be heard.
Well, it is wonderful to be joining all of you this morning. It's good to be here at St. Bart's with my parish family. But beyond that, I'm particularly happy to be speaking to you because, quite frankly, I speak to groups of lawyers and judges all the time. And while they are my tribe and they speak my language, I am very sensitive to the fact that we who care about the plight of people with mental disabilities in the criminal justice system can educate lawyers and educate judges all the time, but it only goes so far. And if we want comprehensive, sensible, compassionate change in the criminal justice system for people with mental disabilities, we need to be talking to people like you. People who are activists, people who vote, people who care. Because unless and until we can give our elected officials and politically appointed officials the cover and the resources to do the right thing, conditions will continue as they are. I want to go to the first slide and talk to you a bit about vocabulary. Mental disabilities is my global term, which encompasses a number of different groups. First of all, people who have serious mental illness, conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or major depression. It also includes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, conditions like autism spectrum disorder, what we used to call mental retardation, but we now call an intellectual disability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, and also neurocognitive disorders, conditions like dementia, something that we are encountering more and more of in the criminal justice system as our population ages. And finally, if you emerge from this room today remembering nothing, I hope you will emerge with the knowledge that people who have mental issues frequently have co-occurring disorders. They may very well have a primary diagnosis, like bipolar disorder or autism spectrum disorder, but chances are very, very healthy that they have a number of different things going on. And this is important because of the type of accommodations they need in the criminal justice system. This is important because of the types of resources they need in order to continue to manage their condition and hopefully, after the nightmare of their criminal case is over, to lead productive and law-abiding lives. For instance, you may know someone with bipolar disorder, but they want to self-medicate. They need to self-medicate. They feel that they need to self-medicate. So they have a substance use disorder. And by the way, book recommendation. Former Congressman Patrick Kennedy and his co-author Stephen Fried have just produced a wonderful book called Profile in Mental Health Courage, and I commend it to each of you. Also on the subject of co-occurring disorders, you may know someone who has autism spectrum disorder, but keep in mind the term spectrum is just that. It encompasses people with many different qualities, many different traits. So for instance, you can have someone, or you may know someone, with autism spectrum disorder, but because of a lifetime of being bullied or being ostracized or being made fun of, they may suffer from anxiety or depression or a profound sleep disorder. Similarly, you may know of someone with an on the autism spectrum who has an intellectual disability. They have, if you will, a very low IQ, and they have severe difficulties with the activities of daily living. By the same token, you may know, indeed some of you may have worked over the years with someone with autism spectrum disorder who is absolutely brilliant in many facets of their lives, but in other facets of their lives, not so much. This presentation is called Challenges and Possibilities, and I'm going to emphasize possibilities at the end, but for now I want to talk about the very real systemic challenges that people with mental disabilities confront when they're going through the criminal justice system. First of all, let's discuss the sheer scope of the problem. Part of the problem, if you will, is we don't even know how big the problem is because there is no uniform, there is no accurate way to assess the numbers. If you talk, for instance, to defense attorneys and prosecutors and judges and maybe probation officers and corrections officers, they will tell you that probably half the people they work with, half the people they represent, half the people on their docket have some sort of mental issue. But beyond that, there are so many people who are undiagnosed or underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. They may not reveal their condition because of a variety of different stigmas and fears, which I'll talk about in a few moments. And there are some people who may indeed not have any mental issue when they are coming into the criminal justice system. But unfortunately, because of the nightmare of going through the process, and certainly if they have to serve time in jail or if they're sentenced to prison, they may very well pick up some sort of condition, some sort of trauma. And there actually now is a term for that. It's called PICS, P-I-C-S, post-incarceration syndrome. And indeed, it is real, and for many individuals, it's debilitating. How did we get here? Now, you see two pictures on here, on this slide. And the bottom left is a picture of a mental institution. And on the top is razor wire that's typically found in a facility like Rikers. In our country, we have had a movement of transinstitutionalization and deinstitutionalization. In the early 60s, we began the process properly of closing our mental institutions. But unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons over the years, many of those individuals have ended up in our jails and prisons. So deinstitutionalization has become transinstitutionalization. And please do not get me wrong. Many, if not most of those institutions should have been closed because the conditions in them were absolutely nightmarish. But by the same token, we as a society have not built a robust system of community-based centers to treat people who have various mental conditions. We don't have enough doctors, enough therapists, enough social workers, particularly in our rural areas. Hence the situation that we have today on our streets and in our neighborhoods. We also, unfortunately, have a system of outmoded thinking. Our criminal justice system has basically taken a public health problem or a safety problem, and they have criminalized people for manifesting the symptoms of their disability. We also, and I'll get to this in subsequent slides, have some legal terms, some boxes, which are very, very confining, and they do not serve this population at all. We also have various stigmas against people with various kinds of mental disabilities. And this doesn't matter what neighborhood someone is from, what educational background someone is from, what someone's family's economic level is. There are various stereotypes, various stigmas in different communities. So for instance, I remember many years ago, after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, a mother of a young man on the autism spectrum said to me, "I'm not telling anyone about my son's condition because they'll all think he's a murderer." People who have a mental illness don't want to be known as, quote unquote, crazy. Parents are sometimes fearful that people will think that they did not do enough or they did not do the right thing. How did they not see this coming? And finally, there is an acute lack of options, lack of resources throughout our country. And this is true whether you are in Anchorage, Alaska, or Manhattan. There aren't enough facilities. The facilities that do exist may categorically exclude certain type of people, certain type of conditions, people who have committed certain types of offenses. And in some respects, it's understandable. For instance, a housing facility may not want someone who has been convicted of arson. A facility which is near a school may not want someone who is convicted of a crime against a child. Another facility may not want to have someone because of liability issues. But nonetheless, There are huge numbers of people in our society with mental issues who don't have an adequate housing, who don't have adequate medical resources. I want to go back up to the outmoded thinking and talk about the legal terminology that we have right now that really does not serve people with mental disabilities at all. The threshold issue, I'm sounding like a lawyer, I apologize, but the threshold issue in any criminal case is the defendant, is the accused competent to proceed? And this was a legal standard established in the 1960s in a United States Supreme Court called Dusky v. U.S., and it requires a couple different things on the part of the accused. That he or she have a rational as well as factual understanding of the proceedings, meaning they know what's going on. And secondly, sufficient presentability to consult with a lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding. In other words, the accused can be helpful to an attorney, can tell them what happened or didn't happen, can give them a list of witnesses who might be alibis, who can perhaps provide helpful information about other people who truly did commit the crime. It requires both of those qualities, and competency measures the accused level of functioning at the time of the legal proceedings, and it's an ongoing concern from the time that person is first in custody through, as perverse as it may sound, the time someone might be executed. Now, earlier on, I alluded to dementia. And I said that more and more people with dementia are getting caught up in the criminal justice system. So, for instance, someone may be evaluated for competency in their criminal case, but as the weeks and the months go by, that person may indeed be incompetent now when before he or she was not. The standard for competency, quite frankly, is very, very low. Families sometimes come to me and they say, well, he doesn't know what's going on, or he doesn't get it. That's not the legal standard. But nonetheless, if someone is found incompetent to proceed, the court orders that they be, quote unquote, restored. So, for instance, you can have someone with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and they may be actively psychotic, they may be incompetent to proceed, but they may have been off their meds at the time they committed the alleged offense. So, if they're given the right meds at the right time, in the appropriate dosage, if they have some structure in their lives, then they may be indeed competent to proceed after a certain period of time. But if, for instance, you have someone with an intellectual disability, they're never going to become competent. They are what they are. If you have someone with an intellectual disability, they can't all of a sudden become competent. Sure, you can teach them to mouth back the response. What does your attorney do? What does the prosecutor do? What does the judge do? What's the difference between going to trial and pleading guilty? They can give a very quick response to that, but there's not going to be any real depth of understanding. Or go back to that person with dementia. You can try and restore that person, but the metaphor I use with families is, once your loved one falls off the cliff, there's no way of bringing him or her back up. The most we can do with people who have mental disabilities is manage their symptoms. And this is particularly true when we have younger people moving through the criminal justice system. Simply because their lawyer, if you will, got them a really good deal, and they got probation, no jail time, no prison time, it doesn't mean that this is going to go away. Their mental illness is going to have to be managed throughout the rest of their lives. The same with someone on the autism spectrum. The same with someone with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. The family, working with other experts, is going to have to continually monitor that person and provide the resources. Otherwise, if God forbid that person should reoffend, there's already an offense on their record. And we know that an attorney's ability to, if you will, get a better deal if our client has a prior offense is all of the more difficult. You've probably heard a good deal about insanity. And virtually every state in the union, except for a few, as well as the federal government, has an insanity defense. And insanity in many respects is the flip side of competency. Competency measures an individual's abilities at the present time. Insanity at the time of the act goes back to the point at which the crime was allegedly committed. Some of you may remember the trial of John Hinckley. And after John Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity, lawmakers throughout the country clamped down, and many jurisdictions tightened, if you will, the insanity defense. So here, the burden of proof is placed on the defendant to prove by clear and convincing evidence. In lay terms, that means if you're accused and you want to mount an insanity defense, the ball's in your court, and you've got a really, really high mountain to climb. Apologies for the mixed metaphor. But contrary to popular belief, there are very, very few insanity pleas entered, in large part because a good attorney knows just how high that mountain is. But also, it often requires that a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist evaluate that individual as close to the moment in time, as close to the offense as possible. And this is important because if someone who is actively psychotic is booked in the jail is going to start giving that person lots of medication. And if a psychologist or psychiatrist doesn't come into the jail until several weeks or even several months later, the meds will have kicked in. And at that point in time, that person will seem, if you will, fairly normal. But when I said earlier that our legal terms are outmoded and confining, I was very, very sincere. In terms of being confining, if you have an intellectual disability, if you have dementia, you're not insane. That's a misnomer. But that's sometimes all we have. by the same token, the concept of insanity basically came from a British case in 1843. But we've been operating under a definition like this for a couple hundred years. In the meantime, thankfully, our medical knowledge has evolved. We know more about how a brain functions, and this is completely inappropriate. In other words, the law has not kept pace with science. Now I'm going to talk about possibilities. Thankfully, we as a society are beginning to realize that jail and prison, many times, is the worst place in the world for someone with a mental disability. Now, I'm going to put a footnote on this. I was speaking once, and there was an uncle of someone with a substance abuse problem and bipolar disorder in the audience. And he said that, thank you very much, jail was the best thing that ever happened to his nephew because finally it knocked some sense into him. Well, that's good for that nephew. But for most people with mental disabilities, jail and prison is the worst place in the world for 1,000 different reasons. First of all, they may be victimized by other people. Secondly, they may be punished for manifesting the symptoms of their disability. And finally, if they have any sensory issues, like sensitivity to fluorescent lights, or loud noises, or different textures, like on a jail uniform, or the taste or the texture of some foods, jail or prison can be an absolute nightmare. So because of that, we developed mental health courts, veterans courts, drug courts, specialized dockets that take into account people's vulnerabilities, people's issues, and also, thankfully, recognize and affirm the concept of second chances and the fact that coming back to sobriety or getting a handle on one's mental illness or learning to manage someone's autism is a very long and difficult path, sometimes with setbacks. Also, more and more states and the federal government are enacting what they call second look provisions. So for instance, if you have been sentenced many, many years ago, and there has been a change in the law, the judge, the prosecutor, may now have the tools to go back and resentence you to a shorter term or give you credit for time served. I talked about brain science earlier, and we now know that the brain is still developing in mid-20s. For some people, indeed, it's a lifelong journey, but nonetheless, we know that one is not mature until at least mid-20s. And there, unfortunately, are many people in our jails and prisons who committed their crimes in their late teens, early 20s. There are now provisions in the laws whereby they can come back and be resentenced. Reentry is now recognized as being an important step in the process. Some of you may be familiar with Bard College's prison initiative, whereby Bard goes into 7 different prisons in the state of New York. And if those individuals in the institution complete their courses, they can earn an associate's degree or later on a bachelor's degree. And what that will do, theoretically, is give that person the tools when they re-enter society to be productive and to be law-abiding and to, quite frankly, take advantage of all the talents which were probably hidden during their term of incarceration. And finally, possibilities at the ballot box. You may remember in the beginning that I said that I talked to judges and lawyers all the time, and that was why I was so happy. Yes, I'm done. Why I'm so happy to speak to you. The reason why I'm so happy to speak to you, other than the fact that you are my St. Bart's family, is because you have huge, huge power at the ballot box this fall and in the future. I was in a courtroom, a federal courtroom in Toledo, Ohio, many, many years ago. And I had represented a young man at trial. Unfortunately, he was convicted. But the judge's hands were basically tied by the sentencing statutes that Congress had passed. And the parents, I think, brought their entire little town of Central Ohio to that sentencing in the beautiful federal courtroom. And the judge, to his huge credit, did give my client the minimum sentence. But afterwards, all of the people were just enraged. How could he do that? How he could not see that this young man had a world of possibilities in front of him. It seemed like a shameful waste of potential. So I gathered the group in a vacant courtroom, and I said, how many of you vote in every election? And they proudly raised their hands. And I said, how many of you have seen television commercials during election time? And they all, of course, raised their hand. And I said, how many of you vote for the people that they will be promised that they will be tough on crime? And they all proudly raised their hand, and then they stopped. And then they realized. So I started talking to them about this is what it really means. And we saw that writ large earlier in the courtroom. I'll end by saying that yes, people who commit crimes, particularly serious crimes, even if they have some sort of mental disability, should be held accountable. But they should be held accountable in a way that's humane. We should not be throwing away lives. We should not be stripping people of their humanity and their dignity and their self-esteem. We should not be locking them in cages. There are other ways that we, as a smart and a sensible and compassionate society, can deal with this problem. And next slide. At the risk of shameless self-promotion, I've edited a few books. The most recent is going to be coming out in a matter of days, representing people with mental disabilities. I am told by non-lawyers that these books are actually fairly readable, and so they might be a good resource for you. Beyond that, I can be found through a variety of different social media, or on Sunday mornings, I can be found at the 11 o'clock service, usually on an aisle seat. So thank you again for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much. much, Elizabeth, and thank you for the work that you do. We have a few minutes for questions. You can submit your questions if you're watching online on YouTube by using the live chat, using the comments on Facebook. You can also email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. If you're here in the room, Brian Johnson has question cards. Just raise your hand. I see one over there. And Brian will come around to you and collect your questions and bring them up. One question we've already received, Elizabeth, is around the role of the church. I think you already addressed this a bit at the end, but I'm wondering if you can talk about what faith communities can do to help those who have mental disabilities as they navigate this system.
Well, we at St. Bart's already do the first, and that is we feed the hungry, and we see it all the time. And we know so often people get in trouble because they're just trying to survive. They may steal a candy bar. They may go into an unoccupied dwelling because it's cold outside. I remember in my youth, I walked into a holding cell and there was this rather scruffy individual, and he didn't even say hello, anything like that. He looked at me straight in the eye and he said, "I want an inpatient drug program." And it dawned on me, yeah, it's 20 degrees outside and there's 6 feet of snow on the ground. Of course he wants an inpatient drug program. But beyond that, I would love to see the diocese here in New York, I'd like to see churches throughout the United States be able to sponsor and support more housing where different kinds of people were not categorically excluded. Because so often I have a client who, because of the kind of offense he's charged with, can't get into a facility, or because he has a long and lengthy record, can't get into a facility. And I understand that. But if we can embrace the concept of second chances, and if we can build some controls into the system, I'd like to see the church, I'd like to see faith communities have the ability, have the courage to do that.
Can you talk about the role of psychologists and psychiatrists in the process? How do you work with them, and how have they impacted the formation of law?
They are crucial to any success in a case involving someone with a mental disability. I mean, for instance, the mother can deliver to the courtroom boxes of records as to how her son or daughter has been treated by various experts over the years. I, as an attorney, can get up and I can talk about the disability and how awful jail or prison might be. But you need a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist to interview the accused, examine records, talk to people like parents, families, neighbors, co-workers, friends, to get a complete picture of that person and to write a report basically drawing the nexus between the disability and how or why that person was vulnerable to committing the offense in question. And you also may very well need that expert to testify at a suppression hearing, like if you want to get a false confession thrown out, you need a doctor to testify why someone with maybe an intellectual disability was vulnerable to confessing to something, or worse yet, confessing to something he or she did not do. Or you need a neuropsychologist to testify at a hearing to talk about how just because the brain is wired the way it is, the person committed the offense that he or she did.
All right, we have a lot. You can, Brian can give you a question card. Yeah, Brian will bring one around. We have a lot of good questions. I'm going to try to fit them all in. Law enforcement. Can you talk about their approach to those with mental disabilities? How can we limit police brutality of those with mental disabilities?
That's a great question. And actually, as I was reading that different slide about possibilities, I realized I should have put up law enforcement. Law enforcement has made some huge strides over the years. I will give them that. There's a program called CIT, Crisis Intervention Training. Police are actively discuss de-escalating, about showing up to a situation without maybe not in uniform, maybe not brandishing a gun, maybe having a social worker along for the call. But unfortunately, it's not enough. Every single week, it seems, we hear of some tragic accident. Part of the problem is the right people are not getting trained. Part of the problem is there's not enough training. Part of the problem is law enforcement are often the first responders to these situations. That's not what they signed up for. They signed up to be law enforcement officers, not people who do medical intervention. We need, quite frankly, more recruits, more qualified recruits in the police academies. Virtually everyone will tell you that. We need police officers who understand that they are invested with a lot of responsibility, and that in many situations where someone has a mental disability, special skills are in order. So we need more training, we need better training, we need wider training, and we need to loop more people into the system who are trained in professions other than law enforcement.
We have several questions about family members of those who have mental disabilities and what they can do.
Every family is different, and every individual is different. And there are 1,000 different answers to that question. I will say this. You as a family, outside of any strategies, should not blame yourself. And chances are healthy that you have done all you could, and looking back, you may realize you should have done something differently. But parenting of an individual with a mental disability is an art. There's no playbook for it. So do not blame yourself, and also you should know that, sad to say, there are many other families out there in a similar position, and frequently they can be helpful to you.
You discussed a little bit housing. How do we make sense of the homeless population and the rate of mental disabilities that seem to be present in it?
Whoa. Well, many people here in New York who are smarter than I have been trying to come up with an answer. There are some, well, going back to the categorical exemptions, there are some people who are thrown out of their housing, who are excluded from different housing options because of who they are or what they have done. Some type of housing is very restrictive in terms of the hours they keep, which is why so many people are out there on the streets. And housing is not always the panacea. But by the same token, for many court-ordered resources, a stable address is the only way they can access those resources.
A question on the punishment versus public safety. How do we balance impulses?
Yeah, Mayor Adams should be answering those questions, not me. I don't have the answer. I'll tell you what I do. When I get on the subway, there are people periodically who are actively psychotic. And those are the ones who are potentially dangerous. And we as a city have become better about intercepting, about diffusing, about de-escalating those situations. Unfortunately, tragedies, yes, still happen. But quite frankly, there are a lot of people in the subways and along the streets who are in their own little world. They're not dangerous at all. And I would caution not to make assumptions, but just to move on and say a little prayer for that person and know that this is an issue that is deep and complex, and there's no single answer.
Someone asks about the victim's perspective. As a defense attorney, how do you think about the victim and their desire for justice, or the victim's family?
It must be acknowledged and it must be affirmed, particularly when you are talking about serious crimes. For instance, several weeks ago, I represented a gentleman at trial who suffered from dementia as well as a traumatic brain injury. And this trial is all a matter of public record, so I'm not telling anything that's privileged or confidential. But he basically beat his wife within an inch of her life. Her face looked like a watermelon, literally. And she was the first witness on behalf of the prosecution. And I had to get up and cross-examine her. How do you do that without sounding like a bully? You have to acknowledge what your client did. And more importantly, you've got to acknowledge what she suffered. And I'm not just talking about the optics for the jury. I'm just talking about as a person who looks at herself in the morning in the mirror. And so I stood before her, and theoretically the prosecutor should have objected, but I think she was so dismayed by what I did that she didn't. But I just stood in front of her and I said, "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Elizabeth Kelley. I represent your husband. And on behalf of my co-counsel and on behalf of myself, we are so sorry about what happened to you, and it is so good to see you back and walking and functioning again." And then I got into my cross-examination. But you've got to acknowledge what has been done. And sometimes families and victims over the years, I don't want to say move on because I don't like that term, but they put things in perspective. And particularly when you're dealing with someone with a mental disability, and if that is explained to them, they understand a bit better. And in many jurisdictions, as a practical matter, a plea can't go forward unless and until the victim consents to it. But victims' pain, victims' sense of justice or desire for what they see as justice is real, and it must be acknowledged.
So we're out of time, unfortunately, but I'll fit one more question in. Repeated long sentences are very expensive. How can we redeploy the resources from this tough on crime approach and put them towards more mental health resources, or how else could those resources be used?
Well, I alluded to some of it earlier. Second look prohibition or provisions, going back and rethinking these extraordinarily long sentences that we gave people. I mean, we as a country went through the era of the super predator when every juvenile was labeled as such. We had 3 strikes and you're out. And instituted a lot of really draconian penalties. And we need to go back and rethink those, particularly for a lot of the people who have been locked up for decades. And we know, actuarially speaking, that people in their 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and sometimes 90s, they're not going to be out there committing crimes like they might have when they were 18 years old. So I'm not just saying willy-nilly open the prison gates, but rethink who is inside and provide a sensible off-ramp, provide sensible re-entry programs so those people are not only decarcerated, but they also have the resources to function and function productively within our communities.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for speaking with us this morning, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here as well. I hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m. as you're able. And I hope you'll be back next week. We'll continue to hear from the expertise of our own community. And Brooks Ishler, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Touro University, will be here to speak with us then. See you.